our speaker of the day, Dr. Mukul Kesavan, and our head, the chairperson of the session, to please join us in the dais.
Would you like to stand up or sit down?
Good evening, friends. As the president of the Alumni Association, it is a privilege to welcome you all today. And this is the first, I think, after COVID, the first event of the Alumni Association, which we are holding from face-to-face and also live streaming. So welcome you all. Those who have joined us through the live stream, we also welcome you. And we wish we can have more events now in the offline mode where we can meet face-to-face. As the president of the Alumni Association, it is also my duty to inform the House about the events that we conducted in the last year. It had been a very tough year for all of us, not only in the community belonging to the CIE Department of Education, but also at the national and also across the world. You know, it was a very tough time, and the Alumni Association team members also got affected, because of which we had planned, every year since we were elected, we planned, with such a josh, we say, we are going to do these activities, we are planning these activities, we are going to launch a journal or collaborate with some organizations. And we started inviting proposals, in fact, from the members of the Alumni Association to proposals to organize the events in association with the Alumni Association. So in collaboration with us. We got a couple of proposals, and we are considering those to hold a conference kind of event that we could not hold last year, but in the following year, we'll be doing it. Also, it was sad that we lost some of our ex-faculty colleagues from the Department of Education, Professor S.P. Tyagi and Professor S.P. Pathak. Professor Janaki Rajan, who was here for a long time and was also the director of the State Council for Education Research Training, and then went to Jamia. She also passed away, and this was very sad. So, in fact, holding those memorial meetings, and I personally, I've been telling our faculty advisor, Dr. Rituwala, that it's very sad that we have been, since we took office, we have been organizing so many memorial meetings. Celebrating the memories is good, but also it's a sad part. So I hope we have more celebratory movements to share in the times to come. Some good things have also happened during this tough phase. Although, CIE is a very peculiar institution, that like Vikas, who is our secretary of the association, Dr. Ritu Bala, who is the faculty advisor, all of our alumni, they are the students of this department, but also some of them are also faculty members in the department. So if something, good thing happens to the faculty members in the department who have been students, Alumni Association feels, we should own up. These are our people. So, for example, Dr. Pankaj Arora is now Dean Welfare of the Delhi University. So we congratulate him, and we also like to share with you that one of our alumnus, Dr. Dhananjay Joshi, has become the Vice Chancellor. And I feel personally very proud because he was my batchmate in the B.Ed group. So he's become the founding Vice Chancellor of the Teachers University, which has been instituted by the Delhi government. So we have high hopes. One of our office bearers, Dr. Chandan Srivastav, who teaches in the University of South Bihar, has been appointed by the government to look at the the Indian languages, the next project that the government is launching. So he will be coming to Delhi for some time. So these are some of the proud movements and good news that we are sharing, and we keep asking alumni to share, good things that have happened to them. Dr. Ajay Singh is here. He's recently come from TIS and joined IGNU as associate professor. So welcome. Dr. Virendra Rawat, who is also part of our team, has recently got awarded his PhD. So congratulations, Dr. Rawat, to you. And if I miss anyone who is present here, so please excuse me for that. But keep sharing your good news with us, which we would like to take forward. I won't take long. Just to say that this is the event where all the alumni association members, they feel really, associated with. They own it and they come for it. If they were regular times, Professor Kesavan, you would have found this hall full, even people standing outside the hall. So, but these are tough times, and but be sure that many people must be joining in the live stream. So you have a good, you are such a popular person anyway. So, and I would also like to express my thankfulness to Professor Shobhat Sinha, because every time, last year, we had the Alumni Association, the Basu Memorial Lecture has a very high profile of speakers from, Professor Upendra Bakshi, Professor Ramila Thapar, Professor Gohar Raza. Last year we had Professor Faizan Mustafa. And after the lecture, I said, after your speech, you have raised the bar so high that, we want to keep up with it. But during the time of crisis, this was a year of crisis, and we keep looking for names, and then Shobhaji came up with the suggestion. We readily accepted. We did not know. So thank you so much, Shobhaji, for this. And thank you, Professor Alumni Association, my colleagues, Dr. Savitri, Dr. Vijendra Chauhan, Dr. Chandan, Dr. Deepi Pathak, and last but not least, Dr. Vikas, and he is my anchor, and Rituji is also my anchor. Any event we have to organize, I just, just say that, okay, we have to do this, and they also come up with ideas, and we are in it together. So thank you. If there is any lapse, I own it as the president of the Alumni Association. So please let me know if anything needs to be improved. We are there, and let's make it better. Thank you.
Now, to introduce the speaker of the day, I would like to invite Kriti, one of our eminent scholars, to come on the dais.
A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you the speaker for the day, Dr. Mukul Kesavan. Dr. Kesavan is an Indian historian, novelist, political and social essayist, currently teaching at Jamia Millia Islamia. Sir is an alumni of St. Stephen's College and Faculty of Arts, University of Delhi. Sir has also attended Trinity Hall, University of Cambridge, and is a proud recipient of the Charles Wallace Fellowship. He is a well-acclaimed writer and political analyst. Dr. Kesavan writes frequently about the game of cricket. His book, Men in White, was published by Penguin India in 2007. His columns have been published in several prestigious and reputed periodicals and journals. Sir is currently working on examining the constitution of a radically pluralistic republic and its subsequent erosion by majoritarianism politics. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mukul Kesavan. I now request Dr. Kesavan to enlighten us with today's topic of discussion.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Professor Sinha, Dr. Pachauri, and especially Professor Namita Ranganathan, who's a very old friend, who in a sense made this lecture possible. I'd just like to say what a pleasure it is to come back to Delhi University. And it's a curious fact, though I spent my youth in this university in the 1970s, a very long time ago. I've never been to the Department of Education until now, and I'm very struck by how much the campus of the CIE reminds me of my own college, not that far down the road. It's a great pleasure, it really is a great pleasure to be back, especially after this long and alienating pandemic. When I first agreed to do this lecture, it was in the expectation that it would be online. And let me say how happy I am that I can actually stand before a flesh and blood audience and speak of matters that concern us without looking into a screen, which is how I've been teaching my students and doing extramural lectures. I'd just like to say that the last few years have been an important time in the history of this republic. And one of the signature elements of this republic has been its pluralism and its diversity. And it's a great pleasure for me to do the A.N. Basu Memorial Lecture on this theme. We're all university people over here, and you will know that over the past few weeks, there has unfolded in the peninsular part of our country, in Karnataka, an important question about the nature of identity, of representation, the whole question of hijabs in college environments. And this has raised large questions of uniformity, as well as questions about identity, fundamental rights, which are currently being appealed and argued in courts. But I'd just like to begin by saying that the anti-colonial coalition that created India, because it wasn't just the Congress Party, it was a Congress Party which was the vanguard of a larger movement. So the anti-colonial coalition that made the Indian Republic was assembled in a sense to house the diversity of India. It didn't completely succeed because we did have partition in 1947, which was a great setback. But nonetheless, between 1947 and 1950, in conditions that were in parts of the country genocidal, one of the remarkable things about the Indian Republic or the Indian nation at that point of time was there was a constituent assembly that sat to create the constitutional structures of a pluralist and diverse republic. I think one of the existential threats to that ideal, to that model of a republican state that attempts to house diversity, the most important threat to that is what I will describe using a quite clumsy word, but I think a necessary and a precise word, which is majoritarianism. And majoritarianism is not just something that afflicts the subcontinent. It's something which seems to enjoy enormous perches in every part of the world. It's almost as if it were a kind of political pandemic that threatens societies across the globe, polities as different as China and Turkey, the United States and India. So in this lecture, I'll try and make sense of what I mean by majoritarianism in a comparative way. So first, a definition. I promise it will be the only definition in this talk, and it's a short one, which is that majoritarianism is the claim that a nation's political destiny should be determined by its religious or ethnic majority. It's a simple, direct, and fundamental claim. And it's important for us to recognize that this claim is as old as the nation state in India. It's as old as decolonization in India. In a way, you could see it as decolonization's original sin. Post-colonial nations in South Asia started life with varying degrees of commitment to a pluralistic or a secular state. This is true of India. This is true of the country that we now know as Sri Lanka, which is then known as Ceylon. But we know that about 10 years after 1947 or 1948, which is the moment of decolonization, these countries were either taken over by military rulers or were transformed in many cases into denominational states by majoritarian populations. So, for example, Pakistan is carved out of British India to create a Muslim majority country. And though its founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, fleetingly seems to support the idea of a non-denominational state in a famous assembly speech, the genocidal violence of the partition effectively purged Pakistan virtually of its entire minority population. By 1956, Pakistan had constitutionally and formally defined itself as an Islamic republic, and it has remained one in one avatar or another ever since. Sri Lanka was founded in 1948, of course, as a secular nation. But by 1956, the politicians who represented its Sinhala-speaking Buddhist majority had begun to try and redefine it as a Buddhist state with Sinhala as its sole official language. And this majoritarian redefinition was aimed at marginalizing Tamil speakers, who were Sri Lanka's or Ceylon's largest non-Buddhist minority, who were concentrated, of course, in the north and the east of this country. Bangladesh, which became independent roughly a quarter of a century after Indian independence, was established as a secular Bengali-speaking state. But after a coup in 1975, a military regime turned it into an Islamic republic. Subsequently, Bangladesh's Supreme Court restored secularism in 2010, but paradoxically, Islam remains Bangladesh's official religion. It's important to understand that majoritarianism implies different tiers of citizenship. Members of the majority faith or the majority culture are viewed as the nation's true citizens. The rest, in a sense, are courtesy citizens, guests of the majority perhaps, expected to behave well and expected to behave deferentially. Now, to be tolerated at the majority's discretion is no substitute for full citizenship in modern democracies. It becomes a kind of state of limbo, a chronically unstable condition. A polity that denies full citizenship to minorities will sooner or later politically disenfranchise them or expel them on the grounds that, despite being residents, they aren't citizens at all. They belong elsewhere, in India or Pakistan, or in the case of Sri Lanka, perhaps across the water in Tamil Nadu, or in the case of the Rohingya in Bangladesh. Myanmar, for example, formally has three categories of citizenship. You can be a citizen, you can be an associate citizen, and you can be a naturalized citizen. The Rohingyas are none of these. They are classified as foreigners, as aliens. The one South Asian state that had formally resisted the temptation of majoritarianism until the 1980s was, of course, ours, the Republic of India. Founded as a constitutional republic in 1950, it treated its substantial Muslim minority, India has the third largest Muslim population in the world, as full and equal citizens. Despite being 80% Hindu, there was no formal sense in which this Muslim minority was expected to assimilate within Hindu culture. The only parties that actually demanded these, like the Bharatiya Jana Sangh, which is in a sense the predecessor of the Bharatiya Janata Party, were relatively minor regional parties with little political power. So for the first 25 years of the Republic, India remained a constitutionally secular state. Now it's important, of course, to note that being constitutionally and formally a secular state doesn't mean that in practice the state doesn't discriminate against this minority or that. But broadly speaking, as a matter of public principle, for a quarter of a century, India remained constitutionally and formally a secular state. In the late 1970s and the 1980s, the political balance of power shifted following the emergency, which is, of course, Mrs. Indira Gandhi's experiment with authoritarian rule. I was a student in Delhi University in this time, between the years 1975, 76, 77, were in fact a time of extraordinary authoritarian authority, and within a student body, a sense of silence and oppression actually prevailed. But the new polity that came into being, the new republic that came into being in the late 1970s and the early 1980s was shaped, in a sense, in a very important way by pogroms. In 1983, for example, 2,000 Muslims of Bengali ancestry were slaughtered in a matter of hours in the town of Delhi in Assam. Unofficial estimates, of course, argue that this number was several times higher. And the indigenous Assamese who were involved in this massacre thought that these Bengali Muslims were illegal migrants from Bangladesh whose names had been unjustly included in the electoral roll. And we can see that the legacy of this suspicion lingers to this day. The debates about the CAA and the NRC are legacies of that fraught debate. Bangladesh, which was at that point of time a new nation, was seen by its unsympathetic neighbors, that included both Myanmar and India, as a net exporter of people. And since these migrants tended to be Bengali-speaking Muslims, they looked and sounded, in other contexts than their own, conspicuously alien. The 1983 massacre in Assam was a landmark in Indian politics. The student organization whose anti-Muslim activism led to the pogrom established a political party that handily won the next provincial election. So the incident illustrated several tendencies. One, it showed that illegal migration was a serious problem, that Bengali Muslims were a political scapegoat, and most significantly, that pogroms were politically profitable. In 1984, the next year, the assassination of Indira Gandhi by two of her Sikh bodyguards led to the systematic murder of Sikhs in this city and elsewhere. Her son, Rajiv Gandhi, won a large electoral victory after this pogrom, and the lesson of Nellie was reinforced, this time at the national level. Subsequent pogroms of Muslims followed in Bombay in 1992-93 and Gujarat in 2002. And likewise, they were followed by the electoral victories for parties like the Shiv Sena and the BJP, who had been alleged to be complicit in the violence. Minorities hadn't been disenfranchised in India, but majoritarian parties had learned that encouraging violence against them paid electoral dividends. Majoritarian violence has become a shortcut to power throughout South Asia. In Myanmar, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, insecure military rulers sought legitimacy by aligning the state with a religious majority. While in India and Sri Lanka, nativist parties won elections by promoting the idea that the nation was being subverted by predatory minorities. By the end of the 20th century, majoritarian parties were either in power or the principal opposition in every South Asian nation. Majoritarianism in South Asia is not necessarily about targeting Muslims, nor is it provoked by the need to discipline recalcitrant minorities in general. Majoritarian politics results from the patiently constructed self-image of an aggrieved, besieged majority that believes itself to be long-suffering and refuses to suffer in silence anymore. The cultivation of this sense of injury is the necessary precondition for the lynchings, the pogroms, and the ethnic cleansings that invariably follow. Majoritarianism provokes and promotes equal opportunity bigotry. For example, in Sri Lanka, the rout of the Tamil Tigers and the final destruction of the goal of a Tamil homeland did very little to assuage radical nativists. for majoritarian outfits like the Sinhala Ravaya or the Ravana Balaya and the Bodu Balasena, Muslims have replaced the Tamils as the existential threat to Sri Lanka's integrity as a Sinhala Buddhist nation. So I'm trying to suggest that what is important for majoritarianism is not a specific minority, but just the idea of a minority. And it will coalesce around any minority because it essentially needs the idea of a minority to flourish. The Muslim community in Sri Lanka had been orphaned by the civil war. Muslims had long been distrusted by the Sri Lankan state since they spoke Tamil, but they were also purged from tiger strongholds because they were not, in a sense, Tamil enough. Now, in Sri Lanka, the new Muslim threat is seen as demographic, financial, because they are alleged to control trade and industry. And in this, we can, in a sense, see the same tropes that inform anti-Semitism in Europe, the idea of a small community that mysteriously controls the broader economy. And Muslims are also seen as transnational, because local Sri Lankan Muslims are seen as part of a broader conspiracy to Islamicize the Buddhist world. But Sri Lankan majoritarians don't necessarily confine themselves to Muslims. A long-standing campaign by the Jatika Hela Urumaya, which is the National Heritage Party, for a bill that would place strict limits on conversion to non-Buddhist faiths. And we can see in this bill echoes of similar bills in our country and other countries in South Asia, was basically provoked by a dislike of Christian missionaries. Even Pakistan, whose population is almost entirely Muslim, some 97 or 98% Muslim, has begun to target minority Muslim sects. So, the point I want to drive home is that majoritarianism is a kind of political pathology. It has nothing to do with the minority at issue. It's provoked by the idea of a long-suffering majority that wishes to assert itself. So in Pakistan, starting in 1974, you have a 15-year process of Islamicization, which begins in a sense by declaring members of the Ahmadi sect non-Muslims, by passing blasphemy laws that are routinely used up to this day to persecute Pakistan's minorities, and by patronizing fundamentalist Sunni organizations that were willing to commit acts of horrific violence against Shias. Bangladesh, which is another Muslim majority state, has seen a decline, a secular decline, ironically, in its Hindu population, in its Hindu and its tribal population. While the Bangladeshi state under Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has become less explicitly sectarian, it remains, in a sense, a dangerous country for Hindus, tribal minorities, and atheists. When politically mobilized majorities, like the ones that I've mentioned, single out minorities for oppression, writers, political commentators, historians sometimes reach for historically loaded comparisons. So, for example, let me recite a list of majoritarian leaders: Marine Le Pen, Viktor Orban, Vladimir Putin, Jair Bolsonaro, Recep Erdogan, Aung San Suu Kyi, Xi Jinping, Mahinda Rajapaksa, Bashar al-Assad, Narendra Modi, Benjamin Netanyahu. All of these leaders have at one time or another, by historian, political scientists, opponents, been described as fascists. And this is not an exhaustive list. Now, there's a question about the appropriateness of this category. Right? Is this label an appropriate label? Is it correct, legitimate, or reasonable to use this term, or is this just a term of political abuse? I grew up in this university in the 1970s, and basically you called anybody whom you politically disapproved of a fascist, right? Especially if you thought that you were on the left. So a serious question that we should address is this a useful category with which to understand, say, majoritarian tendencies in contemporary polities today? Now, the appropriateness of this label is complicated by two considerations. One is a historical one. My discipline asks me to ask this question: can a political tendency that is so closely associated with the histories of Germany and Italy and Japan in a particular time, the period between the world wars, can this be usefully generalized to describe other polities removed both in time and space? So that's the first question. The second one is it accurate to describe right-wing governments in internally democratic and externally peaceful countries as fascist, when the signature trait of historic fascisms like Germany's and Japan's was their genocidal, warmongering violence? There are two questions that we should at least try and address before we decide whether this is an appropriate or a useful label. Now, to the extent that political parties call themselves fascist or admire historically fascist figures, it's reasonable to call them fascist in the same way as you would call Mao's or Stalin's followers communists. You know, this has particular contemporary relevance right now because in the ongoing invasion or conquest of Ukraine currently, one of the reasons adduced by the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, is that he wishes to denazify the Ukrainian government. And there's a history to this. The history is, of course, that during the Second World War, when Hitler's armies came through Ukraine into the Soviet Union, they were aided by Ukrainian, right-wing Ukrainian militias led by a man called Stepan Bandera, who was explicitly fascist. His followers were fascist, and he has a whole generation of followers in contemporary Ukraine. For example, the military regiment called the Azov Battalion, which has been integrated into the Ukrainian army, was an explicitly fascist militia. So it's reasonable to call someone who calls themselves fascist. I mean, you know, that's self-description. But this doesn't really answer the first question, which asks whether a particular historical conjuncture can be usefully abstracted into an analytical category. Nor does it answer the second question, because many governments or parties that have an ideological family resemblance to Mussolini's fascists or Hitler's Nazis might not, in fact, slide into mass violence. Because, you know, the second question was, can you call a party that might seem fascist, but actually presides over a reasonably orderly democratic system and is not actually attacking its neighbors, fascist? So when someone like Viktor Orban is described as fascist on account of his anti-Semitism or his hostility to homosexuality or his opposition to immigration, the term actually does double duty. It's both a pejorative critical description and a prediction. Orban is called a fascist because he shares the anti-minority prejudices of historical fascists. Implicit in this characterization is the fear that his politics might devolve into a welter of genocidal violence. So the question is Orban fascist if the violence doesn't happen? So is fascism the institutionalization of a particular form of majoritarian bigotry? Or does the accuracy of that characterization depend on specific violent outcomes? Must all real fascism lead to concentration camps, ethnic cleansing, or genocide? Or can fascism achieve a stable equilibrium in a functioning democracy? Well, these are enormously important questions, both for civility in political discourse and as a way of understanding our own countries. Now, to describe a currently non-genocidal majoritarian party that plays by the rules of electoral democracy as fascist generally implies a sequence of meanings. One, the party described as fascist has succeeded in making the persecution of minorities the basis of that country's nationalism. Two, the democratic system that the party currently inhabits is likely to be set aside or hollowed out in the way in which the National Socialists subverted the Weimar Republic. Three, if unchecked, this process will culminate in the formal isolation, disenfranchisement, even the expulsion or murder of minority citizens. So this is broadly the sequence of meanings that is implied when you choose to call a political party fascist in a context that otherwise seems reasonably democratic. I just want to try and illustrate this by looking at the recent political history of a neighboring country, namely Myanmar. And it's interesting to see that it is during the transition to civilian quasi-democratic rule between 2012 and 2017 that Myanmar became a purely majoritarian polity through ethnic cleansing and by formally excluding Rohingyas in particular and Muslims in general from every democratic process and institution. I just want to repeat that. One of the great ironies of Myanmar's slide into genocidal majoritarian violence that verges, in some people's views, on the fascists, is that this occurred during a democratic transition. So one of the things that perhaps this tells us is that the notion of representation in a democratic way, or electoral politics in itself, may not actually be the kind of bulwark against fascism that perhaps we would instinctively think it to be. In the run-up to the elections of 2015 in Myanmar, the military junta excluded Rohingyas from the new electoral rolls. An ironic instance of disenfranchisement as a function of democratization. So while they are creating these electoral rolls, the exclusion of the Rohingyas is completed. I mean, they were always fairly marginal, but now they are formally, systematically excluded from these electoral rolls. Once this formal exclusion was complete, the Rohingya were corralled into internment camps. So up to this point, you had Rohingya populations in the Rakhine province, which borders Bangladesh, who lived in townships, in villages, some of which were predominantly Rohingya, some of which were mixed. But now, once this formal disenfranchisement happens, even that marginalized normalcy disappears. They are actually now formally pushed into internment camps, and the rest is history. History teaches us that disenfranchisement and internment are preliminaries to violent expulsion if the location and demographic distribution of the stigmatized minority permits such a purging. In the case of the Rohingya, they conspired to allow the government of Myanmar to do precisely that. Does this make Myanmar a fascist state? Some expert observers don't think it does. They cite, for example, the history of Rohingya separatism in the early years of Burmese independence and the role of the British in encouraging the settlement of the Rohingyas, of Bengali-speaking Muslims during colonial rule. And they cite historically sound reasons for their outsider status. And they argue that the independent Burmese Republic had good reason, in a sense, to refuse to grant them full citizenship. The fact that Rakhine Buddhists, the people that the Rohingya shared a province of Myanmar with, that Rakhine Buddhists were themselves persecuted by the Burmese state, but they nonetheless loathed the Rohingya as encroaching outsiders. You know, the same kind of thing that happened to Assam vis-a-vis Bengali Muslims happens in Rakhine vis-a-vis the Rohingya. This is sometimes offered as proof that the marginality of the Rohingya wasn't a function of majoritarian hatred, but the reality of who they were. Bengali Muslims, the fact that many of Burma's insurgent minorities, I mean, you know that the Bamar, who are the principal Burmese community and who dominate the Burmese state, have ongoing civil wars with many minority communities. And many of the people who defend the Burmese state against the allegation of fascism would say that, look, even these other persecuted minorities refuse to make common cause with the Rohingya. And that therefore, there must be something genuinely alien about this community, something that justifies their incorrigible otherness. China's treatment of the Uyghur in Xinjiang shares some features with Myanmar's dealings with the Rohingya. Both the Rohingya and the Uyghur, it's important to realize, are demographically concentrated Muslim communities in a border region adjacent to majority Muslim nation states. Bangladesh in the case of the Rohingya, and Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan in the case of the Uyghur. Their contiguity to a larger Muslim world is one reason why these Muslim minorities are seen by their nation states as a threat to political unity. This, quote, Muslim hinterland is seen as a source of both secessionist feeling and jihadi violence. Unlike the communal bigotry stoked and led by the monks of the Buddhist Sangha that drives Myanmar's hostility towards the Rohingya, China's campaign to dissolve Uyghur identity into a Han mainstream is powered by what could paradoxically be described as a kind of secular majoritarianism, a kind of cousin of France's state-sponsored laïcité. China, like France, wants an Islam supervised by the nation state, insulated from the extraterrestrial influence of foreign Muslims. Oh, thank you, that's very good. Now, China hasn't expelled the Uyghur in the way in which that Myanmar brutally purged the Rohingya, but it has tried to sever their connection to their homeland in three ways. It has corralled more than 1 million of them in so-called re-education camps. It has systematically suppressed their language and their religious institutions. It has razed their mosques. And thirdly, it has forcibly relocated and dispersed working-age Uyghur to other parts of China. So is violent ethnic cleansing on a massive scale, which is of course the Myanmar example, a more clear-cut symptom of fascism than mass internment, mass surveillance, the systematic stifling of religious practice, the sterilization of Uyghur women, the razing of mosques, and the official suppression of the Uyghurs' that subordinates and destroys a minority community through genocide or expulsion without significant protest from civil society is fascist. Then Myanmar is a functionally fascist state. In the Chinese case, there is no evidence of mass killing or large-scale expulsion. The domestication of the Uyghur is remarkable for being an optional piece of social engineering. Remember that the Uyghur pose no existential threat to the Chinese nation. This orchestrated atomization of a people is justified as a preemptive precaution, as a form of abundant carefulness. Xinjiang is on a massive scale a kind of behavioral laboratory, and the Uyghur are test subjects in a massive Pavlovian experiment, where in a sense you're training a population to behave on command. They are disciplined and punished and monitored in real time and in extreme close-up. Digital surveillance, internment, and the political omniscience of a party state, and China is in the end a party state, have combined to turn the Uyghur into lab rats in a glass-walled habitat. Xinjiang is Orwell's 1984, read as a prescription, not as a warning. Thus, China's achievement in materially transforming the lives of the majority of its people, of raising hundreds of millions out of poverty, balance out Xinjiang. Where does India's majoritarian tendencies rank, if they figure at all, in this survey of actually existing fascism? How immune are Western democracies to this plague of majoritarianism? Let's try and answer that last question. So how safe are Europe's democracies from the majoritarianism that nudged Myanmar into violent ethnic cleansing, and China into the systematic dissolution of the Muslim Uyghur. Europe is an interesting case in the contemporary history of majoritarianism, because Europe as a continent is generally seen as the home, correctly seen as the home of resilient democracies and Enlightenment values. So it's useful to examine how resistant its nations are to the anti-minority politics in the ascendant in so many parts of Asia. Now, two member states of the European Union, Poland and Hungary, have become notorious for state-sponsored bigotry. The European Union has considered sanctioning these states for their anti-Semitism, their homophobia, their hostility to immigration in general, and to Muslims in particular. Their majoritarianism is very similar to Myanmar's. The religious identity of the majority has been weaponized to distinguish real citizens from false ones. In Myanmar, Buddhism and its Sangha were mobilized in the service of majoritarian politics. In Poland, it is Catholicism and the Church. But important though Poland and Hungary are to the politics of Europe, they won't determine its political direction. They're not important enough for that, because they are doubly marginal. They are part of the EU's post-communist Eastern Rim, and they are latecomers. They joined the EU's core countries 12 years after the Maastricht Treaty in 2004. The EU was the brainchild of France and Germany. These are the two countries central to the project of European unification. And it is the fate of France in particular that will shape the nature of the European project. I just want to quickly say that those of you who've been following the French presidential, the run-up to the French presidential election will know that all the polls show that 30% of the French electorate supports the far right. We're not talking about the right in general, but the far right. So Eric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen both lead rival parties for the votes of the far right. The Republican Party, which used to be a party of the center-right, has, under its current leader, gone much further to the right in order to steal the voters of Zemmour and Le Pen. On the face of it, France is historically vaccinated against the virus of majoritarianism. The French Revolution's root and branch hostility towards the Catholic Church and the determined religion blindness of laïcité, France's take on secularism, ought to guard both state and civil society from backsliding into bigotry. This assumption, however, makes the mistake of assuming that majoritarianism is about religion, when it is a project of ethnic consolidation against a nominated minority. The revolution in France led to the emancipation of Jews, for example, from formal discrimination. It's one of the great achievements of the French Revolution. But amongst the majority, including France's intellectuals, emancipation was seen as sort of double-edged. Emancipation was seen as the preliminary to complete assimilation. So casual anti-Semitism is rife in Enlightenment France. Diderot, for example, was anti-Semitic, as was Voltaire, the great standard bearer of free speech. To say this, to note this, is not to ask that we cancel our intellectual forebears for failing to be perfectly consistent or progressive. It's merely to observe that the intellectual pioneers of liberty and equality and fraternity were willing to caveat their principles, both explicitly and in practice, that these caveats had historical consequences. Post-revolutionary France, having deleted the church from the public realm, imagined that it had created secularism. In fact, all it had done was to elevate the average Frenchman, complete with his cultural preferences and prejudices, and minus Christianity, into the archetype of the secular citizen. His habits, his fashions, I say his because it is a masculine world, his habits, his fashions, his rules about facial hair or head coverings, his definitions of overt religiosity would now define France's good citizen. Laïcité became an inquisitorial rule, a way of obsessively policing and suppressing public difference. Government officials specifying how much skin women have to show before they can swim on a public beach doesn't strike the French as grotesque. This is the Gaullist version of "we shall fight on the beaches." In 1905, when laïcité was formally enshrined in law, the burkini would not have been an offense against French secularism, because every woman who visited the beach at the turn of the century was similarly covered up. A century ago, in the early 1910s or 1920s, the French woman at the beach wore a wool dress up to her knees with bloomers underneath, and the skin beneath her knees was covered by stockings and bathing slippers. The French in their current state don't seem to see the absurdity of defining secularism in terms of rising hemlines and changing fashions. Laïcité makes the historical experience and practice of a relatively homogeneous Christian population in the 19th and 20th centuries a template for regulating the behavior of a much more diverse modern society. The French simply assume that laïcité is culturally, historically, and religiously neutral, untouched by France's imperial history, uncolored by its experience of Christianity, or its association with racism, or its encounter with anti-Semitism. Laïcité is dangerous because it makes a virtue out of intolerance. 19th century French intellectuals, who should have known better, saw no contradiction between Republican virtue and anti-Semitism. Having parked their own Christianity in its proper place, they were keen to purge Jews of their Jewishness so they could vanish into the Republic. But we know that the assimilation didn't help. There are poignant stories about patriotic French Jews so ideologically assimilated that they couldn't bring themselves to reproach the Republic for interning them in Vichy France. Eric Zemmour, the Jewish anti-Muslim French politician, is the perfect example of complete assimilation. Germany's Jews, let's not forget, were the most thoroughly assimilated minority in Europe. This April, 1,000 French soldiers, including 20 generals, some retired, others on the reserve list, signed an open letter in a right-wing magazine, warning Macron that deadly dangers threatened France. They warned that a civil war was brewing and denounced Islamism and the hordes of the banlieue, the mainly Muslim immigrant suburbs that surround Paris. The defense minister denounced the letter and threatened sanctions, but no concrete action was taken against the signatories. Marine Le Pen, leader of the Front National and Macron's most formidable rival for the presidency, endorsed the letter. There are around 5 million Muslims in France. Now, if Marine Le Pen were to win the French presidency, or if Eric Zemmour were to win the French presidency, which is not necessarily likely, but they have a decent chance of doing it, the danger is that the Republic will accommodate the Front National's neo-fascist majoritarianism without having to change. French liberals and socialists might object, but it is the majoritarianism written into laïcité that allows Le Pen to segue from anti-Semitism to Islamophobia within the rhetoric of secularism. It's the reason why Marianne, France's goddess of liberty, can look like Marine Le Pen or sound like Brigitte Bardot. Europe's anti-clerical Enlightenment thinkers admired Imperial China because they thought that Imperial China had a secular state that was anchored to an ethical philosophy instead of a religious church, namely Confucianism. In Xinjiang, China has repaid the compliment by taking laïcité to its logical conclusion, shaving faces, raising mosques, nationalizing Islam, and educating Muslims out of their beliefs. No one in France or Europe, or indeed the world, should say that they weren't warned. To conclude, I just want to say that the principal strategy of contemporary majoritarianism is singling out a group, demonizing it as an alien fifth column, and then publicly making an example of it. Myanmar, which is a kind of pseudo-democracy, ethnically cleansed the Rohingya from Rakhine, a province bordering Bangladesh. China, which is a communist autocracy, has set itself the task of dissolving the Uyghur as a Muslim community. France, a Western European democracy, shares China's suspicion of Muslim extraterritoriality. Political parties and voters across the political spectrum have targeted French Muslims as a dangerously unassimilated minority. We've just spoken of Marine Le Pen and Zemmour. Now, France's Muslims are in no imminent danger of disenfranchisement or ethnic cleansing or concerted violence, but they do constitute a politically beleaguered minority, singled out for suspicion by both state and civil society. Now, despite the enormously varied contexts of majoritarian politics and policies in these three countries, they have some features in common. In all three cases, there seems little or no significant opposition to the singling out of the stigmatized minority by civil society groups or political parties, other than those who speak from within the minority community itself. Of dealing with inconvenient Muslim minorities. Using the police or the army or the bureaucracy against a minority serves several purposes. It indicates to the general population that the minority is a kind of underclass that does not have the protection of the state. An underclass is a prerequisite for successful majoritarianism, because the poor, subaltern, working class sections of the nominal majority, whether it's Han or white or Buddhist, are best mobilized by offering them objects of hatred more wretched than them. Pogroms and vigilante violence constantly reiterate and celebrate this public subordination. Phone cameras, Facebook Live, and WhatsApp shares allow people to vicariously participate in violent subordination on an unprecedented scale. This simultaneity, this sense of sharing a moment with thousands and millions of others creates a kind of virtual solidarity. It's like watching a kind of Premier Division match, Premier League football match in England live. You might be thousands of miles away, but if you have a dog in the fight, you feel a sense of belonging, of ownership that you wouldn't feel in the absence of this live telecast. Majoritarianism is, amongst other things, a live carnival that you can be a part of. There's a particularly grotesque incident which I think illustrates this perfectly, that was extensively covered both in the social media and in clips online, and was very extensively reported in India. This was this grotesque incident where a photographer jumped on a man who had just been shot dead by policemen in Assam. And this photographer, in a sense, is a creature of two intersecting history. The first is the history of state-sponsored majoritarianism, which in India generally, and Assam particularly, is beginning to devolve into a form of fascism. The photographer knew that stomping on Muslims dead or alive was sanctioned, in a sense, by the zeitgeist. But he was also performing for the camera in a way that is the signature behavior of this digital age. The clip that went viral is in itself an example of the ubiquity of the camera in the modern world. So, for example, just to just describe this incident so that you get a sense of what I'm saying, you first see the photographer stamp on the man, and immediately after, a policeman hits the prone body of the dead man with a lathi, almost as if he's corroborating his death. The photographer then kneels the dead man, videoed and turned into a home movie for someone's delectation. The dead Muslim would like to still have been killed by the police, But the photographer wouldn't have done his ghoulish death dance. That was an act of performative depravity rooted in the idea of an audience. The important thing here is the spectacle, the ecstatic rage and furious joy that bearing witness to righteous violence brings. We've been here before. A few years ago, there was a video of middle-aged men calmly beating ragged Dalit workers with metal slats and filming themselves in the act. The provocations on Indian news channels are a form of performative depravity, as are the political pronouncements of the more brazen representatives of the majoritarian right. When white Southerners in the American South gathered to watch a black man being lynched, they participated vicariously in the dispensing of summary justice, because the black man was, in their view, an oversexed animal given to molesting white women. Something like that feeling is harnessed by campaigns against love jihad, by the criminalization of the cattle trade, by the lynchings that keep predatory minorities in order. If majoritarianism is to be understood as a global phenomenon, India is the paradigmatic case. This is simply a matter of scale. India not only has the largest population in the world, it is home to 200 million Muslims. This is the size of the total population of Nigeria, Africa's most populous country. India's Muslim population is both dispersed and massive. Only Indonesia and Pakistan have larger Muslim populations. Even if the Indian state wanted to, it couldn't do what China and Myanmar have done: reduce or disperse or expel a relatively small minority compactly located in a frontier province. Fascism is a misleading term for majoritarianism in India, because given the defining precedent of Nazi Germany, it implies a Big Bang death camp climax. This is both wrong and a distraction from the real danger. Majoritarianism in India is not premised on a final solution. Majoritarian parties and organizations are unlikely to attempt large-scale ethnic cleansing or try to corral 200 million Muslims in concentration camps. This is not an account of moral scruple, but because the logistics of both exceed India's state capacity. Majoritarianism in India offers a tasting menu, not a main course. Love jihad, vigilantism, lynchings, public beatings, urban riots, the threat of the National Register of Citizens, the Citizenship Amendment Act success in smuggling in a religious criterion for citizenship, the ransacking of minority universities, the taming of Kashmir, these hors d'oeuvres help to feed the beast. The success of the Gujarat model in segregating and subordinating Muslims in that state sustains the majoritarian wager that campaigns of episodic intimidation and violence can replicate the success on a pan-Indian scale. India's majoritarians believe that this carnival of contained but exemplary violence can indefinitely sustain an election-winning majority. I just want to end by asking a question that, the ascendancy of majoritarianism in so many parts of the world calls into question the historical significance of India's experiment with pluralism and secularism. The broad popularity of majoritarian parties and leaders all over the world can be taken to mean that the ideal of representing diversity is not just a local Indian failure brought about by the successes of majoritarian parties in the subcontinent, but it also represents a more general defeat of the idea that nations ought to do better than merely suffer minorities. If this is true, this is a world historical defeat. I have argued in the course of this talk that both historical fascism and contemporary majoritarianism confront minorities with these choices: extinction, expulsion, or coerced assimilation. These aren't, of course, choices. These are, in fact, fates that are assigned by nations to their minorities. While totalitarian states and illiberal democracies are more prepared to use massive state violence to achieve their majoritarian ends, countries that think of themselves like liberal democracies, as France does, are increasingly willing to discipline minorities through law and propaganda. So what if we assume that the victory of majoritarianism in India is a permanent victory, that it signals the end of the pluralist experiment inaugurated by the Republic in 1950? that in a sense we are witnessing the constitution of what we would call, after the French fashion, a second republic. You know, the French have this way of numbering their republics depending upon how constitutionally they change. So what if this is the second republic? What then would the historical significance be of India's experiment with pluralism if it is in fact snuffed out? Its importance is this. If the Indian pluralist First Republic hadn't existed, we wouldn't be able to invent it. It was created by a unique historical conjuncture, the decolonization of a subcontinental empire. The Indian nation state, that was one of the end results of this process, there were others of course like Pakistan, was historically singular, but the constitutional polity that it created through pragmatism and idealism, intention and error, produced precedents and practices that are now available to the whole democratic world. Sorry. Now, this is not the space in which to attempt a kind of exhaustive inventory of these precedents and practices, but I just want to focus on the central insights of constitutional pluralism. The first of these was that a democratic state can take formal cognizance of difference and inequality. Unlike France, where the principle of laïcité created a willed blindness to difference and therefore prevented the state from even gathering the information that might allow it to address systematic discrimination on the basis of these differences, the Indian Republic institutionalized affirmative action in its founding charter, in the schedules of its constitution. This is historically important because once a democratic state incorporates affirmative action as a part of its political project, it becomes a precedent that can be examined and evaluated by other democratic states. It ceases to be a kind of wispy rhetorical aspiration and becomes a real-world practice. The fact that India has scheduled castes and scheduled tribes who have a special claim upon the attention of the state is important not just to India, but to any discussion in the world where people discuss inequality and what governments can do to systematically tackle it. The Indian Republic is sometimes accused by its critics of fetishizing diversity. The most obvious example of this, as we all in universities know, are the number of gazetted holidays that we have, which scrupulously nominate days of rest for the special days of virtually every faith community in this country. You could see this as a kind of unproductive pandering, or you could think of it as a way of reminding Indians that everyone's religious practices are formally acknowledged by the state as equally worthy of attention. It is, if you like, a public way of making room for everyone, of not allowing the weight of numbers to define who is worthy of public attention. One of the most important examples of intellectual parochialism is the absence of the experience of India from the debates about the shape and political direction of, say, the European Union. Geographically, India and Europe are subcontinental extensions of a single Asian landmass. They are roughly the same size, though India is more populated and more diverse. The reason Europe dignifies itself as a separate continent has nothing to do with geography and everything to do with its erstwhile imperial dominance. India's achievements and failures as a subcontinental democracy ought to interest the EU's architects and ideologues, as well as its critics. The controversy about the EU's treatment of its poorer constituent elements like Greece, the often resented dominance of Germany and France, the legitimacy and necessity of redistributing resources between the poorer and richer regions of a single monetary union would be richer if the experience of India, a country that incorporates radically unequal regions, was factored in. This is not to argue that India is an exemplary nation, merely to say that its experience and practice of managing difference, economic, cultural, religious, linguistic, in a pluralist way, represents a living political experiment that every Democrat and political thinker should refer to as case study, as inspiration, or even as a cautionary tale. I was reminded of the significance of India's secular and pluralist constitution by a recent essay by a brilliant Naga academic, G. Kannatu Trophy. And he says in this, and I just want to quote this to end this talk, he says, "I belong to an emerging class of educated Nagas who consider themselves constitutional Indians. Many of the young in my community, and perhaps the Northeast more broadly, are culturally conservative, proud of their region's distinctive history, tradition, language, and ethnic identity. But at the same time, seeing and desiring common ground with fellow citizens in other regions of the country that have their own, sometimes almost incomprehensibly different language, history, and culture. For a Naga, this common ground is the idea of a modern and secular India, as the truly Ambedkar-inspired constitution defines it, not the largely elite and grammatical notion of a timeless Indian civilization and tradition dating back thousands of years, unquote. The reason why the Indian constitution strikes a Naga scholar from India's borderlands as the one platform on which he can feel a sense of citizenship with other Indians is that this constitution was shaped and framed by another scholar who wrote from the margins of Indian society, whose community had been at the receiving end of this timeless civilization that now seeks to remake India in its own image, and who was therefore acutely aware of the need to establish citizenship on the grounds of rights, not of culture or of civilization. The Constitution is a living reminder that a political culture, unself-conscious about difference, that tries to co-opt people into majoritarian practice, risks alienating. This is as true of laicite as it is of Hindutva. To quote Trophy again, the umbilical cord connecting Nagas with mainland India is not the cord of a shared ancient history, religion, or culture. That link is tenuous and has to do with the ideas of equality, justice, and liberty enshrined in the Indian Constitution, unquote. What is true of Nagas is true in principle, or ought to be, for all Indians. As the sittings in my university, Jamia Millia Islamia and Shaheen Bagh reminded us, the rearguard action against majoritarianism in India has to be fought on the ground of Ambedkar's Constitution. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, sir. Thanks for bringing together so many diverse ideas in a sort of interdisciplinary matrix to help us understand the nuances of majoritarianism and its manifestations. Now, to take the program forward, I would like to invite the chair, Professor Shobha Sinha, for her remarks.
Why don't you come here?
Thank you for this very nuanced description of majoritarianism, and the fact that you talked about fascism is a term which is very loosely used, as are many terms like liberalism or even leftist, liberals being labeled as leftists and so on and so forth. We have a diverse audience at least. So this is a very complex topic, and in your comparative perspective that you have shared about different countries, I don't have a very depth understanding of history, but then nowadays one doesn't have to. Everybody becomes an expert. But it reminds me of when you read about history before the World War, and you know that rampant nationalism across places, and something is happening. One day it would be nice also to try to understand that why is it happening at the same time, you know, across the world, this kind of thing is happening. Anyway, coming back to our context, in education, we are very situated in the context of political, economic, and otherwise in our country, and we have to deal with that in many ways, especially in our classrooms. A lot is happening in education nowadays. There's a lot of excitement for certain things, but many things are not, we need to think about more deeply. Inclusion, equality, these terms are very popular nowadays. We'll find courses over there, but a deeper analysis of what goes on is very important. And I think that I would like to just share an incident with you. I was observing a classroom a few years back, with one of our interns who was teaching, and it was some NCERT course about positive discrimination or something like that. One child in the class, I think it was 7th or 8th grade child, he said very confidently कि ऐसा क्यों होता है कि लाल किला या जो भी हिस्टोरिकल मॉन्यूमेंट दिल्ली में देखने जाते हैं तो मुस्लिम्स के साथ उनको कम पैसा देना पड़ता है और बाकियों को बहुत ज्यादा देना पड़ता है. He said it so confidently that for a minute even I was kind of, and when you argue like that there is no answer, why should others not pay less either? But then I recovered and I said that the only notice I have seen is कि बच्चों के लिए नहीं लगता है, लिखा रहता है foreigners को बहुत पैसा देना पड़ता है, तो तुम ये कहाँ देख के आए? तो he was a bit taken aback. नहीं लिखा रहता. By that time my student revived a little bit. He said कि तुम मुझे ले चलना दिखाने के लिए and all. But the whole point was the confidence, you know, about saying that, and that he felt so wronged. Another time, one of my students, she told me कि किसी भी हिंदू किंग के लिए एक अच्छी चीज लिखी जाए तो चिढ़ हो जाता है और मुस्लिम्स की तारीफ होती है ना. I said the thing that I'm always hit is that they are so absolutely, you know, aggrieved and confident that you for a minute are taken aback. So later on, I asked her in the next class that historians may not like that description, but golden age किस dynasty को कहा जाता है? तो उसने कहा Guptas. So I said, you know, when I was in school is also ancient history, but even I was taught that. So ऐसा नहीं है कि ये grievance बिल्कुल सही है. But you are right that it has to feed into it all the time. You have to keep on creating that to feel, you know, kind of justify what you choose to do. It was very enlightening to see, you know, how different countries have responded and what, how India is going about. So I hope that in future we need to think a lot more about it and not very overtly about things that are happening and how it impacts us, our classrooms, because at least when we are dealing with, you know, the teacher education part of a program, we have to go Monday morning and face a lot, and it does come to the classroom. It is not that it is left out, or it is usko cover up kar do, baat na karo uske bare mein. I don't think it works. So this is very important, and we need to continue these discussions. Thank you again. Thank you. And I want to thank the Alumni Association for organizing this. But Anupam, when you were talking about alumni, you left me out. I also was an alumni in CIE. I did my B.Ed from here. So we'll settle that later on. I do take exception, and many others. So I thank all of you. Vikas has been organizing many things. Latika, who is another alumni, she has been looking at this stage, working and trying to sort out the detail. Professor Ritu Bala was acted as a liaison between trying to work out the details and, you know, dealing with a vast alumni association that exists. So I'm very grateful to all of you. And I want to thank my friend and colleague, Professor Namita Ranganathan, because I was not, I had contacted you earlier, and at that time it didn't work out. So I had said that I'll invite you again in March. And then I realized that he had said 2 months would be a good preparation time. And I realized that it was a couple weeks gone already. Then I told Namita that you talk about this, and she succeeded. So it's very good to have you here, and I hope we'll keep on interacting, you know, because our students do a lot, you know, we are not just focusing on history as such, but from educational perspective. For example, in our first year B.Ed programs, they visit actually all the students, different sites in Delhi, and discuss that, try to understand that better. So I hope someday will be even, yeah, it will be part of that. So again, thanking you, and Vikas, I wanted to take over. Thanks for coming on a Saturday evening, all of you. Sure. We'll just take few because we don't want to be in the room for too long. Just a couple. Go ahead. Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. But there's been this long-standing, certainly electoral calculation that there's that famous slogan that the BJP has that while you people depend upon arithmetic, we depend upon chemistry, which was actually a kind of response to the idea that subaltern caste fractions can, by coming together, create a kind of obstacle in the course of the totalizing nature of Hindutva. Is this a successful endeavor? I mean, for example, we see that the Dravida movement in what used to be Madras presidency and is now, of course, Tamil Nadu, succeeded in mobilizing dominant peasant communities and allied caste groups in a kind of permanent Dravida political coalition. I think this has been tried in different parts of India, most notably in UP with varying degrees of success. But I wouldn't say that that subaltern caste solidarity in itself is some kind of solution to the problem of majoritarian mobilization. I don't think that, I mean, we've seen this. We've seen this proposition being proved wrong in the last election in UP, for example, where the BJP did overwhelmingly well, and in national elections as well.
One more and then we.
I'm sorry, do you want to clarify what you mean by an electoral minority? Because that seems like a non sequitur. You can't come to power if you're an electoral minority. Oh, look, I mean, the thing is that in a first past the post democratic system like ours, which doesn't have proportional representation, it would be very unusual for a political party to get more than 50% to come to power. I mean, generally speaking, if you win a plurality of the votes, I mean, if you win more than 40%, you're likely to win a kind of overwhelming majority. So I don't think that is necessarily a comment. For example, one of the criticisms often made, or one of the consolations often provided against the BJP's success is that, they just won 32% of the vote, or they won 39% of the vote. I don't see this as significant because 32 and 39% of the vote is a lot of votes in a non-proportional system of representation. I mean, the Congress, or indeed any political party that won in India, with the possible exception of Rajiv Gandhi's extraordinary landslide in 1984, all Indian political parties win much less than 50% of the vote to come to power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So I would like to share with you that every year we award one of the all-rounders of MA program with Professor Anantnath Basu Memorial Award. So last year we did acknowledge the contribution and the sincerity of one of the scholars, but we couldn't felicitate them. So for this year, we have invited two of our scholars, and I would like to request you to please felicitate them. The first is Shagufta Anjum. Shagufta. Shagufta is it? And the second is Arushi Batra. Arushi, please come in. Come on back.
Well done. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, sir, that's it. Yeah. So I would like to now invite Vipin to give a vote of thanks.
So good evening, everyone. On the behalf of Alumni Association, we would like to thank the speaker, Mr. Mukul Kesavan, for enlightening us and broadening our thoughts on the topic of majoritarism. And we would also like to thank the chair, Professor Shobha Sena, for her valuable contributions and comments. We would also like to thank the CI staff who has helped us in organizing the event. Chandni ji, Surender ji, A.R. Girish ji, S.O. Gulzar Ahmed ji, and also their team, the account department team, Vinod ji, Mamta ji, Deepika ji, and the caretaker Ravi, the Sulabh staff. Last but not the least, I would like to thank the audience for your valuable time. We would also like to proceed you towards the Tagore Garden in the lawn for the meal, sort of a small meal. I would like the guest a snack time, yes.
Great, that's lovely.
Sir, I would like to request you to please proceed. We can go after the guest of honor. Yes.
No, just, thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
अनुपम एक रख लो कहीं पर, नहीं तो ये